People love being scared. They love being spooked, they love being dragged, and most of all, they love being chased. It's why it's one of the most defining mechanics of any horror game since the guy with the scissors in Clock Tower back in 1995. Survival horror is probably my favorite genre, despite not handling scary games all that well.
This is so horrible. I'm having such a horrible time. I'm having a bad time. F*** off.
It's the thrill of being able to push through harrowing odds that really just gets my blood pumping, or coming around a corner and seeing this guy ready to clobber you.
F*** off.
It shouldn't be fun, and yet for some reason, our brains tell me and many, many others that we just can't seem to get enough of it. And I want to know why. Why do we like being chased? So I call the psychologist. That's Dr. Ken Carter. He's a clinical psychologist and professor at the Oxford College of Emory University. And for the past few years, he's been heavily focused on sensation seekers, people who seek chaos, new experiences, being scared, that whole deal. He even wrote a book about it called Buzz, and he did a pretty solid TEDx talk as well.
So there's actually two different ways you can go about explaining it. Freud talked about the part of our id that loves what's called the pleasure principle, which means it loves tension reduction. So anything that reduces tension creates pleasure for us. You may have heard of the death instinct that a lot of people have, sort of the wish to be dead. That comes from Freud's idea of the pleasure principle. So knowing that something's chasing you that could kill you creates pleasure for the id.
In layman terms, id doesn't actually just stand for a game development studio. It also stands for our innate animal-like instincts. So it's the thing that makes us eat food or identify something we should be afraid of or making babies. So to be chased or to be chasing something feeds into that rawest form of just acting on pure impulse. The other side of Freud's theory is the death instinct, which is the idea that people enjoy experiencing near death without actually dying. So think about people who enjoy roller coasters or go bungee jumping, or to tie it back to games, being chased by a dude in a fedora or a tall lady, but with a screen between you and the danger of it actually happening. The Freud theory is one way of explaining it. The other is the scientific way, or more simply, chemicals.
And so we have these two different chemicals in our body that sort of regulate stress. One's called cortisol, which is sort of a stress hormone that revs up our body. And the other one's called dopamine. And dopamine is important for creating pleasure. So when we're being chased, we create lots of cortisol and lots of dopamine. And depending upon that balance of cortisol and dopamine, being chased can be really exciting and fun because it creates that biological sense of pleasure.
So if things like scary games stress you out, well, it's because your brain produces a lot of cortisol, which causes that tensing up sort of stressful feeling. And also another perfect explanation as to why I reacted the way I did to Five Nights at Freddy's VR.
Can I?
Bonafide cortisol overload. That was horrible. Now, if you walked away from being scared with the intention of doing it again because apparently you had a good time, there's nothing wrong with you. That's just the dopamine talking, which is the opposite of the stress chemical. And like all things, it comes with a balance. Some people who produce less cortisol will deliberately seek out stressful situations to get that chemical balance, to feel that excitement. It might even be a way to explain why some people just prefer to play games on easy mode. There's nothing wrong with it, but they just might be stressed out if they did anything higher than that. Or why some people just prefer super hard games and find really easy ones to be exhaustingly boring. Now, initially when I first started researching this whole thing, it doesn't take long to do a quick search on why people get scared and find several sources that just say the adrenaline rush, which has some of the exact same chemicals that Ken was referring to, like cortisol and dopamine. But is that really just it? Are we just feeling little tiny adrenaline rushes that make us excited? Well, Ken says it's a little bit more complicated than that.
I was talking with Will Gadd. He's an ice climber. He's the very first person to climb up Niagara Falls when it was frozen. And he said that adrenaline is a lousy drug because it's linked with that cortisol. Like he said, if I just wanted adrenaline, I would just run back and forth in the street. The adrenaline sort of gets in the way of you being able to do really detailed stuff. because it's linked with that sort of fight, flee, or freeze response that people experience. It's why you can't push the right buttons to be able to escape things in those games. And so the right amount of sort of calmness in chaos in order to experience that pleasure is probably what more people are about than just their sort of heart beating and feeling stressed out. It's more complex than just being an adrenaline junkie. And the funny thing is that a lot of those high sensation seekers produce less adrenaline than average and low sensation seekers, because their body doesn't identify those things as being dangerous and stressful. And so they're just experiencing that dopamine, that sense of pleasure, which is sort of what they're after in the first place.
Clearly, I don't like being scared in games, but I do like the ability to fight back if I'm terrified. If I have no means of protecting myself, my cortisol goes into overdrive and my dopamine puffs into a smoke and I lock all up. In a way, Mr. X and Lady Dimitrescu are kind of like embodiments of cortisol. And me having an arsenal or gun kind of represents that dopamine to level it all out. The fight is vital to the chase. It's the opportunity to possibly overcome something terrifying. Or, as Ken puts it, because he's like smart and educated, emotional regulation.
You have to be able to control your emotions in order to do well in the game. It's not just sort of running away and avoiding stuff. You have to sort of know what's in your arsenal, how to use it, how much health you have left. And if you just get swept up into the chaos of the fear, then you're not going to do well. And so that ability to regulate your own emotions is something that a lot of people who are high sensation seekers really love to do, whether it's fear or anger or whatever. And what you're sort of focusing on is the ability to control your own sort of anxiety or fear in order to do well in the game.
And that right there, that's my high. That's the good shit. Pump that emotional regulation right into my veins. So, does knowing all of this explain people's obsessions with being chased, or people like Lady Dimitrescu? Sort of. I'm not gonna go into the obsession part of it, but we all know it's because she's got a wonderful smile and a big old personality.
Wave long.
But I feel like I at least understand myself a little better and why we may instinctively just enjoy the thrill of being chased and scared. And most importantly, my new favorite drug, emotional regulation. You may not at all be into scary games, and that's fine. Everyone's different. Take Ken, for example. That dude has dedicated his work to understanding sensation seekers, and he couldn't even watch the trailer for Resident Evil Village.
I will not be playing it.
Oh, you should. It's a real romp.
I watched 10 seconds of the link you sent, and I'm like, nope. It looks terrifying.
He may not be playing that game, but I sure as hell will be.